Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of Your Break It Down show. Our guest is Wil Reilly, who is a political scientist from Kentucky State University. He has been on the show before, so we're welcoming him back. And today he's talking about the 1776 Unites Project, which is a response to the questionable 1619 project from the New York Times, where they sort of struggle with the truth and focus on social narratives rather than actual facts. So the 1776 project looks at this from a more scholarly approach so we can have a better understanding of what's there. Hey, joining us today is my friend Brooks Crenshaw, who actually happens to be really passionate about this topic. He's a veteran friend of mine and also a fellow spy. So good to have him around to ask some very, very good questions. I think you'll appreciate what is going on here. 1776unites.com is where you can go to see the project and what they've created. And I think you'll find some very powerful narratives there. The point is, it's not necessarily to tear down what 1619 did, but to provide a more positive and uplifting version of the same type of work. So hopefully we'll get some attention on this and give people a chance to experience the 1776 project. All right, here's how you support the show. Share, like, subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends, buy the shirts. Those are the things. Go to the 1776 Project. Tweet at Wil Reilly, so that way he knows that you got there from the Break It Down show. Those kind of things help out and help us show to other people, hey, this show matters. People love it. And if you love it, that's what you got to do. That's how you get us the attention that we need to make this show bigger still and get even better guests. All right. One last thing. As always, save the brave. SaveTheBrave.org. Go to the donate tab, put a small amount of money in each month, and you'll be doing a tremendous service for those of us with PTSD as we try to battle and keep these warriors alive when they come home. All right, here we go. Wil Reilly.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, this is Dr. Wil Reilly of the Kentucky State University. You're listening to the Break It Down show, as always, with Pete Turner.
Yes, we are doing it once again, trying to cause a ruckus. Obviously, everybody should, and this is still a current book, so you guys should go check it out. It's called Taboo, the 10 Topics That We Can't Discuss, I think is the full title. And it's crazy. You should go back and listen to the episode when we talk about the book. There it is in the background as Wil does it. We're not recording video, but what I want to say is that book is excellent because it takes topics that we can't talk about. For example, white privilege. Turns out having a dad in the house is significantly more important than any kind of white privilege. And just the way crime moves and race and all of these things, IQ, all of that stuff is covered in there. Extremely uncomfortable topics because what you believe and what reality are going to be are not going to be in tune with one another. So I highly recommend that. We also have with us today co-host Brooks Crenshaw, who's always fun for me to talk to. And Brooks and Wil both share a Kentucky residency together, so hopefully those guys will get a chance to meet. But all in all, gentlemen, Sunday morning, thanks so much for coming on. Wil, let's first talk about why the 1776 project, and then let's slide into the 1619 stuff.
Well, the 1776 project, or 1776 as we usually bill it in terms of what we actually trademarked, is a pro-American, black-led, black-owned, I guess you could say, although everyone is welcome, response to the New York Times 1619 project. And we want to take it broader than that. We want to have more of a footprint than that. But essentially, I'd say there are 3 core points to 1776. I mean, one is pointing out that a lot of the things in 1619 and in that Howard Zinn take on American history just aren't real. I mean, at one point, the 1619 project claimed that the USA broke away from Britain because we wanted to preserve slavery. That's insane. Britain at the time was no better than we were. They had slaves. They didn't emancipate their slaves in overseas colonies until 1833. If anything, if you look at Irish slaves of war, what they did with black and mulatto West Indians, I mean, Britain had a much wider racial diversity of slaves than we did. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So we were making some of those points. I think point 2 of 1776 is a real look at slavery and segregation, and for that matter, the race wars in our country's history, whites versus natives, without minimizing those, but in context. Is it really accurate that chattel slavery made the South the wealthiest region of the country? No, that again is factually inaccurate. The South was generally considered to be a feudal backwater until after the Civil War. That was classic plantation agriculture of the kind you would see in Southern Europe. I mean, that was not the economic powerhouse of the USA. I mean, it's worth noting that there was an anti-slavery movement led by Black and white people of goodwill for obviously the same period of time that there was slavery in the USA. That's why we don't have slaves anymore. So correct context would be point 2. And I guess point 3 would be offering an alternative kind of inspirational view of what the USA is and should be. So, I mean, if you look in a sentence from me, the United States of America is a flawed but very good society where it's frankly not that difficult to succeed given hard work and personal responsibility. People regularly come to the USA from what we half mockingly call third world countries, Vietnam, Ethiopia, so on down the line. Nigeria might still fall in that category, North Korea, and become more successful in all of those cases than the average for our native born white and Black citizens. So it's a bit ironic that there are these constant immigrant success stories, white and Black and Eastern, all around us. But instead of focusing on this, we are teaching our people to endlessly rehash race wars with one another 150 years ago and this kind of thing. It's the opposite of a success-based strategy. I mean, think of someone who's been an executive, who's been a coach, teacher. So, I mean, that's kind of our focus. What is actually needed to look at some of the problems in the USA? If illegitimacy rates are virtually identical among Blacks and poor whites, and that's a new phenomenon, well, how do you stop fatherlessness is a real question. Whereas, which group's oppression did this originate with is kind of a worthless question. Assuming that there's any validity to that thesis at all, answering it wouldn't solve the problem. Who cares?
Right. And the other thing I wanted to bring in with this, especially your first point, just talking about the lack of factual credibility with 1619, the argumentative gerrymandering to make this thing a white European problem, leaving out Albanians and all kinds of other white European folks, that at 1619, this ship just magically shows up full of slaves. Turns out that the U.S. had slaves well before 1619, that the first Thanksgiving is legitimately considered to be in St. Augustine with the Spanish well before 1619. There is evidence that there were hundreds of thousands of people in South America enslaving each other well before 1619. So to act like this premise that somehow it's a bunch of British guys that come here to bring this thing, it's just, okay, great. If that's true, what about all these other people? I mean, what about the indications that the population in the Caribbean was over 1 million people? It's like there's so many problems factually. Tell this important story, but let's not make this about these guys are the only guys who are assholes here when everybody was playing by the same rules at the same time. Now, look, I'm a layman, but help me understand. Is it fair to look at 1619 and see something? Like historically, we know that it's not accurate, but is there something valuable in terms of understanding race or anything, or is it just more? I can't take it seriously, man. I'm being honest.
Well, I don't think narratives are valuable out of context. I recently got into a dispute with a right-wing writer online. I don't have a huge problem with this guy, so I'm not going to name him and start some kind of silly Twitter beef. But I felt that his website, which was tackling the issue of urban crime, seemed to focus entirely on crimes involving Black guys. And I bet to myself as a Chicagoan that it wouldn't really be hard to find crimes in cities involving, say, Italian or Spanish guys or Antifa fighters. And it was the most laughably easy thing in the world. I just Googled Antifa beating. And there were suddenly hundreds of videos of poor white guys committing crimes. So, I mean, I think that there's some value to saying, look, we have a crime problem in cities. Sure. What can we do about that? Again, that's the question to ask as a leader, whether you guys are talking as war fighters, whether you're talking as a business executive, you're talking as, a higher level athletic coach. There's a value to discussing what's really going on, but there's no value to presenting problems without solutions. And there's certainly no value to presenting problems without solutions out of context. That's the definition of bad leadership, presenting problems without solutions and exaggerating them. So, I mean, in this particular case, the guy is saying, well, look at all these black crimes. It would be stupid for me to run an alternative website called like Poor White Fights, dedicated to Antifa fights or to crimes in urban Irish neighborhoods. That would just make me a racist. There'd be nothing productive that I'm doing. And it's the same thing with 1619. Of course, we need to recognize that slavery is a part of American history. But the context there is that slavery is a part of world history. What the 1619 Project did is specifically pick a starting date when whites, in our senses of the term, with slaves, arrived in the Americas. So prior to this date, obviously, there'd been one, slavery in the Americas. The Aztecs were one of the most brutal warrior peoples in history. I mean, one of the most highly trained, effective, certainly Neolithic or Copper Age armies we've ever seen. They gave the Spaniards a run for their money during the Noche Triste battle, for example. They had tons of slaves. They ate them, actually. I mean, they ritually sacrificed people to their god of war, Hooty Pochli, the terror behind your shoulder. They had a great pantheon. So there's that. And then even if you want to say, well, Europeans engaged in a new form of slavery in the New World, okay, then you'd have to talk about the Spaniards, many of whom are Hispanic or mestizo in our terms, or the Portuguese, not a few of whom are black in our terms, who are the people to get here in the late early 1500s. And they again had tons of slaves of every imaginable color combination. But that's not what the American left wants. They don't want Hispanic people enslaving black people whose ancestors enslaved the Hispanic people. You don't want to get into that multicolored palette of Moros y Cristianos, right? Blacks versus whites, Moors versus Hispanics. So what you do is you pick the first date that white people who you think might be able to guilt came to the USA with slaves. And that was, in fact, 1619. But no, I think that's a fairly biased picture. I mean, discussing that leaves aside where the African slaves came from. I mean, obviously, almost all slaves sent to the New World were sold by powerful African states like Ashanti, which were fairly near the cutting edge of technology at the time, although not at it. I mean, that leaves aside Aztec slavery, that leaves aside slavery in the New World by people we would now consider minorities. So I definitely do think that we need to deal with our country's history, but we need to deal with a real version of our country's history, which is that when all nations had slaves, we had slaves. It's worth noting, some people might come back and say, well, Will, I mean, those Spaniards that was not the beginning of the United States. Though that was another people doing their own thing in another country. But it's worth noting that 1619 wasn't the beginning of the United States either. I mean, these were non-independent British colonies at the time. The many, many colonials, including free blacks who opposed slavery, had really nothing to say to the British government about it at the time. So, I mean, to some extent, you're picking an arbitrary date when white people, as we now conceive of whites, began the practice of slavery in the New World. And no, I don't think that gives an entirely honest view of what slavery was. Slavery was a human universal until our society ended it.
Yeah. Yes.
From Pete and my background, from an intelligence standpoint, we identified multiple, variables that are part of the problem. As far as the 1619 narrative, I'd like to get your take on the way I see this, and also potentially prescribe a potential solution. One thing is that the current state of the media is in a downward spiral. The business model is unsustainable. It's turning into a click culture, both, all the way up to the New York Times, which historically has been a high reputation in media, and that's less so today. The other issue is that of tribalism, which, Pete and I have had extensive experience in dealing with tribalism, both in Afghanistan. I was with the Kentucky state government. There's plenty of that in the eastern part of the state, and in West Virginia and Appalachia, there is a very Hatfields and McCoys, which is, I would say, a human response to those variables at play in Afghanistan as well as in Appalachia. So I see those two factors as what's driving that narrative. Do you agree with that? And what can we do about it?
Well, I think that there's an element of truth to, definitely there's an element of, that's probably a good chunk of what's going on in the United States. I think the first point you're making is that the media is having trouble sustaining their go-to-market model that they used to use, which is absolutely correct. I mean, the problem for the media is that there are now many alternative. You see this even in the sports media. Clay Travis, the sports journalist, writes a great deal about this. ESPN's model used to be that they were essentially a very high-end middleman for sports product. They would take game scores that almost no one else had, and they would deliver them through their premier packages, Sports Center and so on. The problem is that now anyone with a phone can live stream the game or film the game. You can go on YouTube and watch the game. The NBA actually has given up trying to fight YouTube, so they condense each game to 16 minutes of highlights. So what do you need ESPN for? And what ESPN has responded to that by doing, in my opinion and in Travis's, is trying to make what they consider unique clickbait content, a great deal of which comes from combining sports and politics. So you've got people like Jamel Hill, Max Kellerman, who are really liberal political commentators, and funny ones for all their flaws, that are delivering the sports news. So one effect of that has been the ratings have kept stable. They may have saved their business. But another effect of that is that they're driving away a lot of their old consumer base while they're attracting a new consumer base. I mean, ESPN, I like all sports. I was an athlete for quite a while. But I mean, I notice ESPN hardly ever covers hockey anymore. They hardly ever cover baseball. There's obviously an element that those sports are watched by older whites. Definitely. I think another element would just be that they're watched more by less urban people that watch less TV, that have, for example, blue-collar jobs where you're not in front of the television as often. There's an intensive focus on football, intensive focus on basketball. Getting away from ESPN, back to your question, I mean, all media are now dealing with that. So what you're seeing is a pursuit of clicks, a pursuit of ad sales, really. That's why you want the clicks. You're seeing a pursuit of clicks through venues like social media, and it does turn out that the easiest way to get those clicks is rage. This is one of the interesting things, actually, about the new no-cost ad sales model. It doesn't matter whether you click on the paper because you like it or you hate it. Traditionally, I mean, I used to take the Tribune in Chicago. The Sunday Trib was, what, $2.75? You wouldn't just buy a $3 paper and a lunch to go with it unless you liked what was being said. It at least didn't disgust you. They seem to have a good eye for the news. But you'll look at an article online for free and scroll through all 14 or 15 ads in the article as though this were idiocracy, whether it makes you happy or sad. So I think, yeah, the media has focused on a more clicks model. And one way to do that is to run very tribalist articles that get people either excited or upset. And I think that this does combine with the natural inclination of most of the media in the first place, which is, or natural inclination set, which is urban, coastal, mostly white, although it's not very relevant, upper middle class, 93% liberal, according to Pew. So I definitely think you see more anger-generating clickbait on the left than on the right. Although now you have a lot of savvy, post-college conservatives who, had a fun time in school doing the same thing with the Daily Caller and the Daily Wire and so on down the line, all these edgy sites. The Daily Wire is one of the best meme teams on the internet. So, I mean,
For sure.
I think you're seeing it on both sides. I do think you see more of it on the left. And yeah, some of that is a response to the need to market stories for free. If you're buying the paper, you might want to read legitimate adult things, the week's investment tips. If you're looking at an article and you're going to look at 39 articles that same day, you're going to notice an eye-catching headline. You're going to notice, like we were even joking about the picture of Coleman and all of us in bright colors standing there right behind the podium. Yeah. You're going to notice eye-catching photography. So you see more of that. And a lot of this is about being novel. So that was the thing with 1619, certainly. This is novel. Blacks were at the very center of America. The entire country is evil and based on slavery. I mean, that got millions of clicks. That trended on Twitter. But the question is, what damage are you doing to a stable social order with this kind of thing? What percentage of people are going to believe it is real?
One of the things, too, talking about the media in general is we latch on to certain heels. This is really like WWE wrestling. The Nazis are the all-time greatest heel forever. But for some reason, the Japanese from World War II really get off kind of easy. They're not seen as, to this day, this tropey thing. And the same thing with slavery. Like, I defy someone to speak intelligently about slavery for more than I'll say 8 minutes. And all of a sudden their ability to say something interesting or non-tropey, it goes away because we haven't spent any time understanding this history. We know it's out there. Obviously, it's horrible. Maybe they can say the word indentured servitude and Irish, but then after that, they run out of ideas because we just see it as plantation owners were evil and the government was evil. But in reality, to get 75% of people in a room together in a congressional manner or some kind of a legislative body to agree on one thing, Well, shit, man, you couldn't do that today with something as hard as slavery or anything else. We can't agree on anything. So it seems like media has created this kind of legitimately, again, I hate to even say this. Obviously, slavery is bad, and we don't want to say that it's good, but the way the media presents these things and movies and everything has really taken away the intellectual understanding of what slavery was, what the context of the time was. I don't know if you saw this, but maybe in December, they dug up Laura Ingalls Wilder and said, racist, she hated Indians. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, the lady's been dead for 150 years and has inspired tons of women to write. And that's what the narrative was. And she's been dead for 100 plus years.
Didn't she hate Indians because her dad fought the Indians? Like, that was Little House on the Prairie. Like, the Indians
Yes.
kept raiding them.
Yes.
There were constant back and forth raids,
Yes.
rapes, and so on. I mean, so I think that's a classic example of not understanding history. I mean, the Indian Wars are another example. So I think I'll go back to your starting point there, which is that as you get into the clickbait media era, and as people get dumber, frankly, as fewer people have those foundational experiences, there's no longer mandatory military service, church attendance rates are going down, varsity sports participation is going down, the intellectual college degrees, common core curriculum, those are going down with an increase in degrees like hospitality. So as you see more clickbait, and as people get not dumber, IQs have remained at least the same, but less factually educated, there tend to be tropes, heuristics, we call them in politics, that people have about things. So the idea of slavery would be like brutal master with a whip, pretty girl with shattered face walking into owner's upstairs bedroom, brave black and white soldiers killing the guy a bit later, the end, now we go on to the Oregon Trail. In reality, slavery was a huge chunk of human history. I mean, for most of history, one of the risks, if you were a male in particular, was being a battle captive. And battle captives, unless they were killed, were made into slaves. In many societies like ancient Rome, 15 or 20% of the population were slaves. Slavery was a variable that affected how you were treated, like income or anything else. So slaves in general were treated like crap, but there were also slaves that could rise to positions like satrap or grand vizier that weren't technically in the lineage of the king, but that were extremely powerful. So this is a very complex institution that went on throughout most of history. Because of the prevalence of the heuristic in the USA, there's almost a hostility to nuanced explanations of slavery. Two of the books I read when I started writing about slavery were Time on the Cross by, as I recall, Eugene Genovese, which is an accurate quantitative analysis of how slavery operated, and Black Masters. And Time on the Cross makes the point that slavery was, of course, unpleasant, but that it's an empirically measurable system. Slaves were African battle captives who did a certain set of working class jobs in the United States for a certain period of time. So he looks at diet, he looks at frequency of physical abuse, and finds that slaves were treated slightly better than Irish, Italian, Dutch, etc. workers in the North at the same time. I don't know if I agree with that. I'd rather get punched in the face in a dock fight than hit with a whip. I mean, there's a level of dehumanization. But he says essentially during this period when most males were low-paid or non-paid scut industrial workers, slaves were low-paid or non-paid scut agricultural workers. This is how we can measure diet. This is how we can measure life expectancy. And he says that slaves were treated about as badly as, say, Irish factory workers. Again, more dehumanization, but I suspect that that's probably accurate. This book received a massive amount of criticism because the explanation was, well, you're justifying slavery. And his point was, no, I'm not. I'm not justifying indentured servitude for the Irish either. These things are bad. I'm saying that you can measure living conditions at this time, and they weren't among the worst in the world. Black Masters makes another point. It's a very complex book focused on one family. But the point is that something like 25% of free blacks owned slaves. Minority groups, free blacks, Jews, Native Americans, were no less likely to own slaves than whites. All three of those groups economically, when you consider that most blacks were slaves, were doing fairly well. Native chiefs would often own 400 or 500 slaves. And it just gets very complicated. Those slaves that were captured warriors would sometimes be trained to fight other native chiefs. Other native tribes sold themselves out as slave catchers, like the Choctaw, who would run down runaway slaves using hunting and battlefield skills that, frankly, no whites or blacks in the world probably had at that time. I mean, this was the first time in history a Stone Age people had encountered modern weapons. They must have been legendary warriors. I mean, they halted the USA's advancement for 400 years riding around on horses. So, I mean, imagine those people chasing you through the woods. I mean, so all of this is part of history, and ignoring it without nuance is meaningless. I mean, this is an issue for reparations. I mean, if 30% of blacks and natives owned slaves, and those are the two largest racial minority groups in the country, what do you do in terms of reparations? I'm of both black and native descent, and I'm fairly well off. I mean, my ancestry would have included slaves, but also slaveholders. So do I give or do I pay? And I don't really have an opinion about some of this. I think reparations in many ways is a dumb idea in the first place. But those are questions you have to answer before you make social policy. You can't just point at a date in history and say, bad, bad, ancestor man, bad, which I think we have a tendency to do. Last point, I mean, I noticed that we've moved from, drums on the Mohawk when it comes to discussing Native American Indians to like dances with wolves over the past 150 years. That's probably because the great native war bands, I mean, like Red Cloud, the Indian general, is a man I admire. He was once asked how he got his name, and he just said, the whites saw my army. Like when he rode onto a plane, there were 10,000 warriors behind him painted in the blood of their enemies and so on. And I mean, these people, they lost the war, but they did incredibly well, given that they had stone arrows against parrot breech-loading cannons and so on. We've moved from that, like Red Cloud's army sweeping down from the north to like cheerful people playing with bear cubs. Red Cloud would be disgusted to watch this garbage. But I mean, you need to put history in context.
Don't you think that one of the big intellectual traps that's at play here, and it's something that it's a rule of mine not to fall into, is we judge individuals of history based on our standards rather than the world in which they lived. And having been with Pete, a guy who's seen some of the worst human behavior has to offer in a combat situation and in a combat scenario, that most people fall into the trap in which they believe that were they alive during the Holocaust, they would have been, Schindler. They would not have been the gate guard. They wouldn't have been the bad guy in the situation, when historically that's not true.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, there are two questions there. One, at a certain level, I think most competitors understand that morality is not real in the first place. We must behave as though it is with our wife and dog and so on. But I mean, I don't have the military background you guys have, but in those situations in my life where I've had people pull out weapons on or near me, even things, if there's a 6 or 7 figure business deal on the table, sexuality, assuming that's consensual, you guys have already agreed you're going to do this. You don't do necessarily a whole lot of right and wrong thinking. What you think about is what's probably going to happen and how you're strategically going to handle it. If these two guys come at me, how am I going to respond? If he offers 1.8 million instead of 2.1 and this moves me out of the hood, a real situation, how am I going to respond? So all of this stuff about ethics, first of all, would to some extent complete bullshit. If General Sherman and General Red Cloud were fighting one another, I would assume that would be entirely brutal. Those two men did not, but I assume that would be a kind of a brutal, no holds barred affair that they would, make into something else later. But if we are going to pretend that morality is real, which is something I advise us doing, you can only judge people. An evil person, to a very real extent, is simply someone who's more than 2 standard deviations away from the norm of their time. There's no other way to look at it. Right. I mean, the dominant personality trait in ancient Rome was alpha personality male sadism. I mean, it was extremely, extremely common to bring your date to a gladiatorial event where you'd watch soldiers and baboons tear each other apart and then have anal sex in the stands because that doesn't get people pregnant. I mean, that interesting date, given that the soldiers consented to be out there. I don't care about the baboons. But I mean, like, that's something that in our society would be viewed as insanely perverse. That was a normal evening out. And the Romans were one of the greatest civilizations in history. We can't simply look at them, the creators of all this art, of our own culture, and say these people were evil. Simply put, they were closer to the savage than we were. I mean, this is 2,000 years ago. Christ was alive. Their moral system included stoicism. It was quite honorable. It also included that as a way of relieving stress, letting off tension. I think it's disgusting, but it's stupid to call every Roman evil. Anyway, getting back to the point, 2 standard deviations away from your norm is evil. So we can judge people historically in the context of their time. But yes, Brooks, I mean, your point's absolutely correct. If we try to apply our current standards to people that existed in other temporal and historical and moral eras, that doesn't make any sense.
Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
That doesn't make any sense. It's worth noting that even though an interesting point here, actually, in a sentence. The left only ever deconstructs whites on the right. But if you apply those standards that are so often used to deconstruct Lincoln or Sherman to Red Cloud or Tecumseh, I mean, some of those people, in at least a ritual sense, were probably cannibals. I mean, anyone they captured would be castrated or blinded or would have their hands chopped off. If they really liked you, they might just take off 2 ears and a thumb and then let you go. They didn't have a concept of really keeping prisoners of war around. They didn't have a concept of letting useless people eat. They scalped people, burned people alive. But I mean, it would be stupid to say that Tecumseh was a dishonorable or evil man. Those are just the standards of primitive war, where you don't have any room back in the village for useless enemies you have to keep guard on. So at any rate, yes, your question is correct. People have to be judged by the standard of their time, I suppose.
But in much the same way that you know, a lot of the proponents of the 1619 narrative would also turn a blind eye to modern Sharia being practiced in America, right? They turn a blind eye to, you know, the red clouds of history.
Yeah, I mean, when I've traveled extensively in the developing world. I mean, I was one of those AFS volunteers in Latin America in the late 90s. This was a disturbed time for Latin America. I went to a mostly Latino high school, so I've traveled to Mexico with essentially just personal friends. I think I'm going to Africa in a security and business consulting capacity pretty near future. I've never seen the Middle East, so I would trust you guys' descriptions of that. But if you go to pretty much any society other than America, you notice that the things, not Norway, but I mean, if you go to most societies other than the USA, you notice that the things that woke Americans complain about are much more prevalent in that society. The concept of sexism, at least when I was there, at least outside of the universities, would be virtually alien to most upper middle class Latin Americans. Spanish, actually, as you guys know, has distinctive masculine and feminine endings for every word. The absolute expectation for every woman, and I mean, I went on dates in the area, is that as a man, you would pay for the date, you would open the doors. If there's a physical fight, only you are involved. None of this involves your date at all because you are a man. There's nothing in particular wrong with this, but the same things that outrage feminists about modern American society seem not to outrage them so much about, say, Cervantes. And it's the same thing times 5 in the Middle East, where, I mean, people are literally draped in burqas and chadors and so on, and that's often required by law. So again, I think the point here, I find that conservatives sometimes, and for whatever reason, black conservatives fairly often, sometimes defend indefensible things about the USA. Like, yeah, we used to have slaves, but it wasn't that bad. That's not how I feel. I feel that slavery is, in my training as an upper middle class modern Western leader, evil. I would strongly resist any attempt to implement it in this society, even through, say, some kind of debt servitude. But if we're going to look at the historical path of slavery, that requires looking, frankly, at the fact that Native Americans, Arabs, virtually every civilized group of people engaged in slavery. And this would be true for virtually any practice. Abusive treatment of battle captives has been and is more common in the Middle East than it is in the West. Unprovoked aggressive war, jihad, has been and is more common in the Middle East than it is in the West. So it's fine to speak against these things. It's not fine to dishonestly associate them only with our own society, which happens to be one of the better societies in the world.
In addition to the sexism piece, like, I've never seen as much racism as I have seen in Asia, the Middle East, South America. Like, it is prevalent, and a lot of it has to do with, I mean, with simple skin tone.
Well, when I was in Latin America, it was more a casually friendly thing. Like, Latin Americans weren't politically correct. So people would jokingly say, oh, you're a black guy, you must be good at sports. Or, you know, do you like white women, which is a stereotype of black men with money, which they assumed I had as an American in Latin America. I saw less visceral hatred. I didn't see anything like the alt-right or the crazy black Muslims in Latin America. Latin Americans actually tend to take it for granted that everyone is mixed, essentially. I mean, so I've had people say things like, well, I would be black, but I'm rich. And it becomes kind of a subject of banter. But yeah, in Asia, you're absolutely right. I mean, a good buddy of mine is Japanese, and he showed me some of the warning signs telling people not to do stupid things that are around Tokyo. And what struck me as amazing is that the people in all of the images, like don't go into a tiger cage, are either blondes or they're blacks. Because the idea is that no Asian would ever be stupid enough to walk into a tiger cage. What you have to do is tell the dumbass Westerners, be they, you know, blondes or redheads or Africans, not to walk up and touch a man-eating tiger. And the racism in Japan, for example, from business experience and just reading, doesn't just stop with Westerners. I mean, it extends to people that we would view as indistinguishable from the Japanese. It extends to Koreans. It extends to the original inhabitants of the Japanese islands. I mean, now all these people are Asian. Koreans are stone East Asian, genetically indistinguishable from the Japanese.
Right.
But there's an entire subcaste of Koreans in Japan who are treated roughly as badly as we treated, say, blacks during the 70s, perhaps not the 50s. So again, yeah, there are certain things from savagery and war to racism to the abuse of women that seem to be just human problems. The temptation to most humans who aren't cowards who have traveled have felt the sensation of bloodlust or asked themselves questions about their sexuality or where they want to go in life. This is not something that's new and unique to the West, any of these moral questions. They only, however, tend to be addressed within the modern West by a substantial subset of intellectuals, which is weird. I won't even say it's a problem because most academic research doesn't matter at all, but it's weird.
One of the things that always strikes me as odd is as we judge these things, you know, and we look at, I'm doing quotey fingers, white people, and they're so horrible and everything. Then you, yeah, like you said, you put it in the context, like the Bible is full of groups of people that you can find no historical reference for beyond that because they were fucked away, killed away, whatever. Like, go find me some Carthaginians, you know, like they don't exist. There are so many people like that where, you know, man has been a savage animal for a long time. Now that we're getting to this place, and I'm going to get into kind of a dangerous ground here, so understand that I'm going to try to struggle to say this well. Now we're getting to this place where in America, you can be gay, you can be married. These things are, in a lot of the world, illegal and potentially lethal to say openly. It seems like if we're going to blame white dudes for being these horrible people, we should also say, hey, you guys led the way in so many ways. You create this society where someone can be an immigrant, refugee, and become a House representative person. Like, there are so many wonderful things. You can't have both sides, or you can't have both sides of the argument where you want the benefit of living here, but you also want to denigrate the people that built this system. Just barely, by the way. I mean, how many times, Will, did the U.S. almost fail to exist? I want you to get into that. So it seems like we're not good at balancing the scale, and you know, we continue to have at least less climatic, less dangerous versions of this race war thing. But I was brought up as a Gen Xer to be like, yeah, people are different color. Who cares? You know, like, it just doesn't matter. But we just can't seem to shake that. Like, and as a sports guy, you'll know every time they say the word Tony Dungy, they'll say first black NFL coach or first black Super Bowl winning coach. He's just a fucking NFL coach who was an incredible defensive, you know, strategic guy. He doesn't have to be black. I mean, that's how I was raised. So let's talk a little bit about that racial part of it.
Well, I think there's a whole lot there. First of all, I'll say on the record, white people did do a lot of stuff. I personally, I don't see much of a point to a lot of these online conversations about kind of whose ancestors developed the pig. I mean, I think that most groups of people have pretty substantial accomplishments. So, I mean, African-American or blacks, black people, I hardly ever say African-American. And of course, most blacks don't live in America. But right. Black people almost certainly developed, say, hunting, warfare, and a number of other things human beings do in the motherland of Africa and in heartland countries like Ethiopia. Similarly, dark-skinned Caucasians like the Sumerians developed farming. I don't think any of this is especially challenged. Mathematics was the Arabs, the Arabe as they're called at the time, Arabic numerals, Moorish numerals. Whites certainly are responsible for the Industrial Revolution, the last great social advantage. I mean, the Chinese through the background were more civilized than all of our ancestors most of the time. So, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's a matter of whites are responsible for, you know, the most positive final culture. I think that the white conquerors took the skills from many other peoples and built a great society. It would be as silly for me to thank whites for industry as it would be for you to thank me for hunting or something. But I mean, the idea of cultural appropriation is so stupid because of this, by the way. I mean, it's a Ralph Lauren jacket. The whole idea of professors wearing tweed jackets comes from the Brits. But we fought the English, you know, here in America. Does that mean I have to take this off and wear just a star stripes with 3 holes cut in it? I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think most people are going to start doing that. But in terms of your point, yeah, obviously whites did do a lot. I think that the reason there's so much critique of modern Western society, and this just came to me, but it's the same reason there was so much critique of the Vietnam War. What made the Vietnam War unique as a military conflict was not that it included a fair amount of brutality, or it included dubious, quote unquote, local allies, or it included mildly corrupt generals, because every conflict in history had included these things. What made the Vietnam War unique was that it included television. So for the first time, you could have reporters who, by the way, were of a different social class and political party than most of the troops, came pretty close to betrayal on many occasions. But it included these people following the soldiers around, showing this audience at home what war looked like. And that shocked a lot of people. And it made a lot of people who weren't experienced in the trade of war confident that they had opinions about what to do and what was happening. Similarly, Western culture is not, I mean, it probably is the best of the world's cultures, but it's not unique in being a great culture. I've had a massive amount of respect for the Chinese and Japanese over the years, fairly familiar with those societies. It's not unique in being bad at some things. What it is unique in being is the culture that existed at the time when mass digital media became a reality. So it's very, very easy to critique Western culture, whereas most people don't know enough about other cultures to critique them. Most people, there's a term I use when I speak to business execs, thin-telligent. Most people have a decently high IQ and know a little shit, and so feel very confident about themselves. That's thin-telligence. So if you're debating someone at a cocktail party, if I often won't even talk to someone if I say, well, I like Western culture, and they say, well, we had slaves. Because explaining why that's meaningless would require unpacking the fact that they don't know anyone else had slaves.
Right.
What the other cultures are. Like, do they know what a Westerner is as versus what we used to call an Oriental, an Easterner? Do they know if the Greeks came before the Romans? Very often I'll just say, well, nobody's perfect, and I'll go get a whiskey. I mean, it's a way to handle that level of thin intelligence, that level of knowledge. So I think Western culture is the culture we live in now. One, most people only understand their own culture. Until recently, most people only went about 40 feet from the door of their farmhouse. You know, we're better than we used to be. Traveling salesmen, except for 5 merchants, would have been an inconceivable profession in most societies. But most people only understand their own society, and we now have critical tools, Twitter, Facebook, that we did not in the past, and that leads to a massive focus on our society. One of the things that I've noticed talking to college kids, as someone who has at least a high-level amateur interest in the history of the Irish and the natives, is that many of them don't understand that a lot of tropes didn't evolve with the white and black race wars in the USA. For example, the whip. I brought a whip to one of my classes to represent the oppression of poor men, and someone said it was insensitive to them as a black person. And I said, well, we're talking about England here. Do you think black people were the only people ever to be hit with whips? And it turned out they did. They weren't aware that the whip was the weapon of historical oppression. It's showing contempt for someone. You don't even need to challenge them to a physical fight. You can hit them and they won't resist. You know, they were made out of leather and these crazy things, rhinoceros cocks. I mean, this was a tool that was used for all these thousands of years to beat the poor man. And specifically the poor man. Women generally had other things that were less abusive but more humiliating done. And we went into all that in class, and people said, wow, I just thought that's what slave masters hit black people with. The noose is a similar one. So, I mean, whenever there's a fake hate crime, something else I wrote a near best-selling book about, but whenever there's a fake hate crime on a college campus, you see the ubiquitous noose. And that's a clear sign to me that this is fake. No one who's actually part of obnoxious alt-right internet culture now still wears Klan robes and talks about nooses, as much as I dislike these people. If you saw Pepe the Frog or Groyper iconography, that might be real. But the noose itself has become linked strictly to historical oppression of black people. Nooses, again, were what were used to hang people, especially poor people, in every society until recently. This is another one of those facts that's become somewhat taboo. But if you go through the list of lynchings in the United States, you find 3,000 blacks, but you also find 2,000 whites and Hispanics. This is just a fact. Tuskegee Institute keeps the data. The largest lynching incident in the United States involved a number of Italians in New Orleans who attempted to bring the 1910 Sicilian concept of justice to the USA. A judge sent one of their fighting men basically to jail, so they went and killed the judge. And the entire city, blacks as well as whites, got ropes, went to the Italian quarter of the city and hung 12 guys from lamp poles to make the point that here in the USA, we don't kill the judge if they vote against you. Whether you view that as justified or unjustified, I mean, that would be a typical lynching incident. But the rope, again, has changed form so that it's strictly used to oppress Black people. The point of all this is, yes, I agree, most people have intelligent heuristics about their society, and in post-Vietnam style, most people criticize only our society. Without excusing them, one reason for this is that most people only know about our society.
Yeah, that's a good point. They only know about our society, and whatever fits their belief set, their culture is what they're going to stick with. And I don't blame anybody for that, because look, culture ain't easy. You know, it intersects, and as long as you know you're in an intersection, you can navigate through it. But it requires you to be uncomfortable as you learn how to do these intersections. Something else within this is in the 1619 project. Let me back out and ask you this: the 1619 project comes out last year. Did that inspire the 1776 project, or was this already in the works and they just beat you guys to market?
Well, I think some of the 1776 isn't just a response to 1619. A lot of this, like Bob Woodson's had the Woodson Center for decades. I've given to the Woodson Center. What the Woodson Center is a fascinating experiment where you use kind of conservative, and many of the people that work with the Woodson Center are military veterans, actually. Most of the rest actually come from the athletic or business world. But the idea is that you use conservative principles like competition to go into the hood and make people better. I.e., you offer two groups of young men a chance to compete using Woodson Center funds to go out and get the most jobs, for example, or you offer government granting funds to public housing residents that let them buy their own Section 8 homes. And then the deal is we'll keep coming by and having the young men help out as long as the house is clean, it's well maintained, you know, a family living in it might perhaps be married, so on down the line. So Woodson Center is these traditional American principles applied to the poor. It does a great deal of good. But that had already existed. I'd already given to Woodson, and I'm sure a lot of the other people like Talib Starks, who wrote Black Lives Matter, Carol Swain, who you mentioned, Vanderbilt U, Glenn Lowry, the legendary kind of center-right economist from, I believe, the Reagan administration. All those people had been giving. We'd all been doing work in our own communities. I work with kids. But when Bob contacted us and said, well, 1776, this new idea, I want to launch. I want to do this in D.C. at the National Press Club, which obviously they would book for me and also for most of you guys. I want to do some big donor outreach. I want to do something national. Would you respond to 1619 on top of what I was planning to do this year? Everybody pretty much said yes. And so, I mean, I wrote part of the business plan or the prospectus for at least some 1776 initiatives. And I mean, I'd like to see us have a fully maintained website with new essays cycling up every couple of days. I'd like to see us have an annual conference. And I mean, the themes are obvious. Like one that I would support is, I mean, you have the same problems in Black and poor white communities. How do you fix both?
Right.
I mean, two groups that are often taught to hate one another by corrupt political leaders. How do you fix both? That's something I'd be very interested in. But I mean, Speakers Bureau, I mean, you can book any of our people as consultants. That should be up on the website. Everything from security to diversity in the real sense of how to make a diverse team work. I want us to start doing school curricula. That was originally Bob's idea, but I mean, I think initially he thought it was a little perhaps unrealistic, but I see that 1619 is already doing this. They've partnered with the Pulitzer Center and they have a full curriculum that starts in like grade 2 of teaching kids to be woke. Like, you know, mommy, what is a slave kind of stuff? Like, do you ask your parents about patterns of historical oppression? And to me, this is just bad. I don't think this is the same thing as sex education when you're 7. I mean, before you get to be 15 and start going out on dates, before you can drive, you certainly need to have some realistic understanding of sex. But I don't think 5-year-olds need to hear things like sometimes grown-ups like to put their penis in an anus, which is an actual line from a California sex education course. Similarly, I don't think little kids who need to be learning about math need to sit down and look at questions like who decides what answer is right and what color are they usually? Right. You know, that nonsense. Innocence is something that is admirable only among children, but is very admirable among children. There's nothing worse than a ruined child. So, I mean, at any rate, we decided to respond to some of that. So this already existed. Woodson already existed. We all had fairly profitable businesses. We all worked in the same space. But when Bob said, why don't I just trademark the phrase 1776, you know, before these damn hippies can, and, you know, create the Black Eagle on flag logo and do this sort of stuff, would you be a part of that? Everyone said, yeah. And I mean, I think you've seen a great response from not just like the Black right, but sort of the Black business community. I mean, Clarence Page, who writes for the Tribune, probably by this point has an ownership stake in the Tribune in Chicago, John Sibley Butler, Robert Cherry. I mean, some of the people that are in business advisor role, James Forrest. I think that the concept was, well, we can't just let them do this. I mean, it's fine if that's one voice, but it does not make sense that we would allow, without any opposition from the successful Black community, an entire curriculum targeted at teaching wokeness to 5-year-olds. And so 1776 is pretty easy to get off the ground.
Why is it all Black, at least to start it? Like, why is that even important?
Oh, it's not. Like 3 of those people I named are white.
Oh, okay, good. Okay.
Yeah, like James Forrest and so on. No, I mean, we're absolutely anti-racist. It's worth noting, if you're doing this from a serious business standpoint, you can't be racist. That's against the law. So, I mean, when people ask, and this is something I really think that the left gets away with this quite a lot, where, I mean, you'll have organizations like the original Rainbow Push that are $50 million businesses that are 99.6% African-American, everyone's related. I mean, I think that if that were happening with a conservative organization or just a trucking company at the same level of prominence, I mean, that probably wouldn't be allowed for very long. We are not interested in replicating that model. So, I mean, in terms of the initial group that we had at the event, I mean, to clarify, James was white, Bob Cherry's white. Yeah, I don't think any of these people would mind being mentioned in association with 1776. Beth Feely, who does a lot of our strategic work, is white. We're working with Leopard PR, which is Maria Brazada as company. She's Caucasian, I believe, of Spanish descent. So no, I mean, that's not really relevant. One of the things about diversity is that diversity works when you almost don't notice it for the first 5 minutes. When I went into the first 1776 meeting, my first reaction was, oh, this is a bunch of people in suits. I better step my suit game up because I was wearing my tweed. And my second reaction was, well, they look like they know what they're doing. We'd started with the money portion of the discussion, which is always a good way to begin. And then my third reaction was, oh, the group's 75% Black. That didn't really register because it wasn't important. For any of the things, positive or negative, that you might stereotype a Black man for, it's really unlikely Glenn Lowry is going to step up behind you and take your wallet. Like, there was no, I mean, we're not playing ball here. I mean, there were no positives or negatives that could possibly be associated with the Blackness of Glenn Lowry in this setting. Not, of course, that most Black people are criminals or athletes, but in this case, the diversity just didn't matter. And that's why I didn't mention it. It would strike me as weird. I know why you asked, Pete, but it would strike me as weird to go through a list of your executives by race.
Yes.
And you see people do that more and more often, like our diversity outreach coordinator, Vivian Chang, who's Chinese American, in case you didn't catch that from the name Vivian Chang. And I've always found that kind of annoying. I am noticed that I'm introduced as an African-American social scientist, mostly on left-wing programs. Right-wingers do it sometimes to just, because it's what you do. Yeah. But every time I go on to talk with, a friendly liberal audience, it's like, despite being a proud Black man who teaches Black college, Wil Reilly has some things to say about the Democratic Party. And it's like, Jesus Christ. Like, you could have condensed all that to Wil Reilly. Like, he has a race and he's political independent. So, at any rate, yes, we're quite diverse.
Yeah. I don't like being assigned a platform or like a status of being a Trumper or a MAGA guy, just because I'm white and I go, the guy's allowed to make some good decisions, look around. It drives me a little bit crazy. And I asked the question about the racial makeup partly because the person who doesn't know this is going to make this assumption that it's his Black caucus, speaking back and everything. And I wanted to smash that. And then finally, one of the things that I always struggle with, because, guys like Brooks and I, we've been abroad, you've been to the third world, you see what happens. We are very fortunate here to blend simultaneously a diverse population, which is self-selected for the most part, with a fairly unified approach. When I tell my lefty friends that diversity and unity are really antonyms, like diversity is not just exclusively great, yeah, of course it's great. But when you look at what unity and diversity have, they're different things and they don't really work together well. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I think that diversity is never discussed honestly by either the right or the left, I would say.
Okay.
So just speaking as a professional social scientist, it's my current primary profession, TV talking and occasional consulting and so on aside. Diversity has a number of well-recognized positives in the literature. The first is that it increases cosmopolitanism. So there's no comparing the arts and culture, the cuisine, the dating scene, the patent rate, so on, of downtown Los Angeles with that of even the most sophisticated monoglot cities, Oslo or Accra, or something like that. The second is that diversity decreases groupthink. So you find that diverse countries, for example, are much less likely to fight aggressive wars than purely monoracial countries like traditional Germany or Serbia. Blacks and Asians and so on are certainly willing to fight passionately for the USA, but you kind of need to say why. There's not going to be the same sense of shared ancestral grievance with the French that 100 million Germans would have. Diversity also increases go-to-market for business. The most basic level, you're better as a sales floor if you've got some Asian guys to sell into diverse and Asian markets. I mean, that's undisputed. Now, you could argue enough diversity would dilute that because everyone would be interracial or something. So in 200 years, we'll have to have that conversation. But for right now, increases cosmopolitanism, improves business, decreases groupthink. Now, the left admits that, but they ignore the massive downsides of diversity. Diversity clearly decreases social trust. Putnam found this 10, 15 years ago. He looked at how diverse a city was, and he found that being more diverse did make cities pretty livable. He liked Mexican food. He goes into this whole thing about diverse bowling leagues. But then he gets to the meat of the sandwich where he's like, and by the way, people hate each other twice as much. There were people spent more time inside. There were twice as many ethnic fights. Trust declined. I think that's pretty undisputed. So there's trust, and there's also decreased enjoyment of certain spaces. Both whites and blacks tend, for whatever reason, to be scared of the other group's young males. Looking at American crime rates, I'm not too shocked by that in either case. So, I mean, there are some positives, there's some negatives. I think that managed diversity is good, which is to say, if you take a group of people, if I were king of a country, almost made the jack off gesture, but if in this hypothetical scenario, excuse the goofing around, where I was king of a country, I would let in a diverse mix of people, given that everyone had an IQ score over, say, 98, clean criminal record, and was willing to integrate. And even then, I would probably schedule my housing in such a way that there'd be escape routes, kind of. That if you were a working class person of Italian ethnic heritage, you could, if you wished, buy a house in a neighborhood full of working class people of Italian ethnic heritage. So there wouldn't constantly be the stress of everyone seems different from me. I don't feel like I have a home. But I would certainly allow and encourage diversity. I would just be aware of the caveats that everyone in a leadership role should be aware of. In general, rambling a bit here, I find the left only talks up the positives. I find the right, and especially the alt-right, only talk up the negatives.
Yes.
I had a debate with Jared Taylor about the nature of diversity. And although I think I was a bit glib, I was scored the winner by most of the outlets that would actually review it, because both of us were a little off the taboo charts. But I mean, his comment was just a list of the negative things about diversity. And then I got to say, well, what about the positive things about diversity? And I don't necessarily know if he'd heard some of those claims before. I mean, there's an entire managing diversity literature. So I think, as with everything else, the truth is somewhere in between.
Right.
If you want to run a website called Urban Crime Today, you're doing a public service. But you have to recognize that there'll be plenty of links there to crimes committed by blacks, street violence, and so on. Plenty of links to crimes committed by whites, Antifa wilding and brawling, regular robberies. Plenty of crimes committed by Hispanics, illegal immigration, perhaps. You won't just be able to target one group of people and say this is crime. And I encourage that real social science lens on almost every topic. I want to know what the facts are so I can make decisions that might make my university a few $1 million that might get Appalachian kids through college. There's a goal to all this. If I want to be entertained, I'll read Kipling or Dean Koontz or something. If I want to make business decisions, I want information. And I think very often in the clickbait internet space, you don't get information. You get just BS from one side or the other. That's a real problem. And it's a problem that can affect lives. Last sentence, but I mean, Black Lives Matter is a group I really have an issue with. I've written major pieces about them because what these guys did, it's a group of upper middle class college kids, if you actually look at their leadership, that showed up in hood areas, found the police to be a little bit rude, and then encouraged the police to pull out of hood areas. And the police did. They thought of this as a serious suggestion from residents of those areas, which was a major misread. Something like 4,000 black people plus a few thousand poor whites died as a direct result of this. It's called the Ferguson effect. You saw a massive surge in crime in every major metro center, from white, Charleston, West Virginia, over more terribly to black, Detroit. So these ideas have consequences if they're taken seriously.
I think you just touched on the police brutality issue. I think one of the things that is so often left off the table is the fact that the mayors in these metro areas are the ones that own the police department and own police policy. So when I see a de Blasio you know, walking in protest of his own police department, it strains credulity. But I think that is playing off of the ignorance of the general populace as to how a civic organization is put in place and how it works.
Correct. And I think there really is. I'm a fan of quantitative research where you crunch the numbers, you see the outcomes, but I'm also a fan of qualitative research where you go to the area and you talk to people. I plan on writing a book about poor whites essentially in the near future, and I plan on going to the equivalent of the hood and sitting around drinking beer with people and writing down what they say. But I mean, so where I'm going with qualitative research is if you actually unpack what's going on in most of these urban metro areas, the first thing that becomes very obvious is that these police aren't Klansmen. And the mayors in charge of them are usually minorities. Bill de Blasio is an urban Italian guy with a black wife, black son, who's damn near a communist. So, I mean, without getting into the whole breakdown of de Blasio versus his own police, because I think there have been mistakes on both sides, but the idea that de Blasio is ordering the cops to go out and murder people is fantastic nonsense. He's from a scrappy Italian neighborhood. His wife's black. She's from New York. They're both too left for me to even vote for. There's not a genocide going on there. But if you want to make this claim, you can make this claim no matter what. Like, I've been called a black white supremacist. So, I mean, when I say something like, well, clearly there's no evidence of racism in this case, I'm a black man from a black college and I'm debating you about the actions of a black mayor, what someone will very often say, well, you and the mayor are Uncle Toms. You don't understand my real black perspective.
The Marxist standard of blackness. It's the same thing that's in the LGBTQ community with regard to, Peter Thiel recently being told he's not gay. He might sleep with men, but he doesn't have a gay voice. Read Marxist, essentially.
He just likes dudes a lot, in the bedroom. No, but I mean, I think that this is a very important point, and it's important to counter it. And this is one of the things 1776 says. Actually, thank you. You might have given me an essay for the website, but I mean, like, I could call it, if you're black, you're black. Meaning that what makes a person black is that they're of more than 50% sub-Saharan black or maybe Ethiopian ancestry. That's what being black is. You're more than half African. So trying to redefine black to mean liberal is absurd. But you see this very often. The right is, of course, is imperfect with outreach to minorities and poor whites and every other group we've discussed today as well, verging on ignoring in the one case racism in the other. So I'm not just targeting the left here. But I mean, I'm a man of the center right. I notice this more often with the left. And I don't think that most leftists in the classical purple-haired radical college girl sense really like minorities. When I look at situations I think of as successfully integrated, and we've all talked about all these throughout the program, but I mean, I think of the military. I think with some flaws, but fairly well, do a good job. I think of business. It's about money. You can only waste so much time and all that other ancillary bullshit before your boss fires you. I think of athletics. I think of the groups like AFS that do public aid for others, Habitat for Humanity, Salvation Army. When I think of all those situations, I don't think of a lot of places where I see a lot of SJWs. I don't really very often see someone who self-identifies as a male feminist pushing a tackling sled across a parking lot on a Saturday morning. It doesn't happen. So I don't think that most of these people like blacks. In fact, I find they're very often scared of us. I consider myself kind of a nerdy guy in comparison with most of my friends, but I've often tried to do outreach to social justice groups with the usual suit and loud voice and so on, and just seeing kind of a nervous inability to get anything done. And I think that that's very common when these groups interact with the black community or with Spanish, Hispanic communities. I think that minorities are seen by them as useful foot soldiers for communism. The term, as I recall, is lumpen proletariat, the idea that there's a group oppressed even more than the ordinary proles that don't know why they're oppressed. And if you can convince them of the real issue of class while pretending to be sympathetic to their stupid little cause, then you can recruit great warriors. And I think that that's what a lot of these people, Bernie Sanders, community organizers and the like, want with the black community. In terms of actual issues for the black community, like the black church is very underfunded. We tend to be less. Basically, black communities don't tend to be as good, although we're getting better, as white communities in long-term fundraising. So a lot of the classic historic churches are facing a deficit of funds. I'm not the most religious guy, but if I were going to give to something in the black community, it might be that. Lack of fathers, discontent with illegal immigration. This is another one of those things blacks and working class whites should agree on. Like importing a bunch of very hardworking foreigners to take your job isn't a good thing if you're a working class male. But those actual issues, I don't think the social justice left has any interest whatsoever in fixing. I think the issue is getting Black voters on board and then backing, say, college debt relief. Worth noting, I mean, many Black people go into the trades rather than college, and those that go into college very often either have a military background where it's essentially free, an athletic background, a Southern regional scholarship. So forgiving the college debt of the people that majored in women's studies wouldn't help Black people. Our degrees, when we had to pay for them, tend to be in things like teaching or nursing where you can get a damn job. So we would literally just be giving broke white guys our money. The goal is getting Black people and Asians, imagine that, on board with these ideas by appealing to race. And that's why there's a constant discussion of racism. Mitt Romney is going to put you back in chains. John McCain has no idea how to lead in an integrated environment. I heard that one. I was like, what? Didn't this guy manage a battleship? Like, that's not something that's factually accurate, but it's something that's very appealing to a scared percentage of minority demographics.
And isn't it interesting that, you know, when you talk about institutional racism, one of the lone recent examples of that has been Harvard's policy with regard to Asians.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, institutional racism is an interesting idea. I have a standing challenge on Twitter. You can still find this. It's got something like 172 likes, 300 comments. But I have a standing challenge on Twitter that I'll give, I think it's $500, to anyone who can present me with an example of institutional racism that doesn't collapse if you adjust for two variables other than race. So what I mean by that is, for example, the average Black male income is 86% of the average white male income. Now, first of all, even from the starting point, this would be kind of like my perception on racism, which is, sure, we need to work on the remaining 10%, but 90% of a white male executive, you're not going to starve. There's no excuse for domestic violence or anything. Like, you go out there, earn that, and we'll work on racism. But even that 86%, the gap closes almost entirely if you adjust for two things, age and region. It turns out most African Americans live in the South because that's where the boats stopped. And it also turns out that the average Black man is 27, while the average white man is 58. This is one of those things I encourage people to Google. And I'm a very honest speaker. That's what's called a modal average, most common number. So it closes by about half if you're looking at medians. But still, if there's a 20-year age gap between white man A and Black man B, if you say Blacks commit more crime or whites have more money, you have to explain to me why you're not adjusting for age. Otherwise, either of those points is completely meaningless. How does a 27-year-old Southern white guy do against a Black guy? I haven't broken this one down yet, but I guarantee you 27-year-old Southern white guy and Black guy, those guys are identical, and there's a good chance they're friends. So institutional racism almost always collapses in this fashion. Another example would be SAT test scores. You know, Blacks, by the way, we're doing fairly well now. We get a 960, but whites are still almost an 1100. Good job. I don't think this is something I'd get angry about either way. But although, again, none of us have anything to do with the averages for our groups for people we don't know. But anyway, so but what you find is that 960 to 1000 gap collapses again if you just adjust for hours of study for the test. It turns out Black kids spend more time in athletic practice, more time dating. This isn't a good or bad decision since we're still almost at 1000, but we should probably crack the books a little bit more. If you adjust for time spent studying for the test, the Black-white gap closes. Where I'm going with this is that I find most institutional racism just isn't real. What people are doing is a high school science fair level of social science, where you just identify a gap and you immediately attribute it to racism without checking for any confounding hypotheses. That's ridiculous. But I mean, there's one of the best-selling books of all time, The New Jim Crow, is based basically around this. The author, who's a witty, fun social scientist, I mean, goes to the conferences, but looks at the fact that there are twice as many Blacks proportionately in jail as whites and attributes it to racism, and does an excellent analysis of the history of racism. What she forgets to do is check the crime rates. Turns out the Black crime rate is very consistently about 1.9 times the white crime rate, explains the entire difference. So that's my take on institutional racism in the first place. Now, you made an interesting point there, Brooks, because you say, well, if there's any institutional racism, it might be cutting in the other direction by now. That's a valid point. I've thought about that. I haven't really come to a conclusion. But if you take a standard definition of institutional racism, which is that there's a formal praxis in place that treats people differently based on race, it's hard not to put affirmative action in there, isn't it? And it's not just a Black-white issue now, because, I mean, Blacks are starting to score above Hispanics as we increase more mass immigration becomes frequent. Blacks are beating out at least immigrant Hispanics. Asians are beating out whites. Jews are beating out whites and Asians. So you have a situation where one minority group is overperforming another minority group, and a third minority group is the top performing group in the pool, except maybe for a fourth minority group. So what you're doing is getting into this silly proportional representation stuff where you're saying, colleges are just bluntly saying, well, we're going to have about 45% whites this year. I've heard this, not in my school, but in meetings of higher educators. And I mean, that's probably the worst possible way to pick. The other thing about affirmative action is that it's only part of a whole system of BS college admissions preferences, as you probably know. So when I went to the University of Illinois, the old joke was that only about 1 person in 10 actually got in. We were about a third ethnic, and that's due in large part to our massive affirmative action programs. We have massive scholarships for the state of Illinois, which is a great state, but not perhaps the most intellectual in the USA. A lot of farming going on. We had giant athletic teams. We're talking about the Big Ten Conference. We had legacy programs for the children of alumni. That's probably half of the whites. So when you break down all these preferences, you really find it was more like 20, but not that many people, at least based on my understanding of the system, get into the school. So is there something to be said for getting rid of all that and just letting the best man win? I'd say so. The interesting thing is that it's so complicated now that wouldn't necessarily even screw over my group, middle-class blacks. We'd finish about halfway down the poll in terms of test scores, beating out many immigrant groups, losing to Asians and whites. But we also wouldn't have to deal with white legacies and so on. So what you'd probably see is a campus that was fully 8% black, 6-7% Hispanic, 15% Asian, 5% Jewish. I mean, the minority diversity would be very similar to what it is today. Everyone would just be qualified to be there.
That's the problem with trying to manage a multivariate problem across time. You know, we just we struggle to reliably do that. Hey, tell everybody where they can find the 1776 papers and essays so they can find it and participate.
I mean, we've got a bunch of contact points. If you Google Woodson Center, the first point will be Bob Woodson's Woodson Center with a link to 1776. We also have the website 1776 Unites. I believe that's .org. We also bought .com, though, so if .org doesn't work, go to 1776unites.com, 1776unites.org, those major site. I'm one of the founding members. I can be found. I'm on Twitter, WILFRED, REILLY, Facebook the same. And I mean, it's just as easy to locate Khalid Starks, John Wood, Coleman Hughes, Carol Swain. I mean, many of the Glenn Lowry, John Sidley Butler. These are in general pretty well-known, almost famous individuals. So reach out to any and all of us. I'd be glad to take your questions, and I'm sure Bob and the rest would be glad to take your money.
Hey, man, thanks for coming on and chatting with us.
Good thing, guys. Thanks for having me. It's always a compliment.